Man, I am so sick of these hit pieces veiled as academic works that are really only designed to attack men. Tired of it. So let's get into it. What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope you all are well. Had some sound trouble today, so it ended up something I think erased all my settings. So this is going to be interesting. I hope everything comes out smooth, but if you do detect any sound issues, bear with me. I apologize, but this is what it is, right? So anyway, support the show, like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will, so we can continue to grow and develop this black male analysis, and do so independently. Make sure you do that. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, so on and so forth. You can donate right here on YouTube with the super chat, or you can go ahead and head over to Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon, where you can become a member and support the Onyx Report and or the Institute for Black Male Studies. All right. So I think I got this piece from probably about 15 people from Psychology Today. Piece written by Dr. Greg Matos, The Rise of Lonely Single Men. And this is basically male feminist hit pieces, on men. These kind of shaming tactics and, this kind of slant of the data to suggest that men are lonely and so on and so forth. But we're going to give a little more context to that, especially in regard to black men. But let's get through the article itself so we at least can put on the table what it is. And as usual, I will keep all the links in the description box so you can check any of the things I post on the screen for yourself. With the rise of lonely single men, dating apps, and a drastically changing relationship landscape. Dated August 9th, 2022. Key points: dating opportunities for heterosexual men are diminishing as relationship standards rise. Men represent approximately 62% of dating app users, lowering their chance of matches. Men need to address skills deficits to meet healthier relationship expectations. All right. So he starts out by saying younger and middle-aged men are the loneliest they've ever been in generations, and it's probably going to get worse. This is not my typical rosy view of relationships, but a reality nonetheless. Over the last 30 years, men have become a larger portion of that growing group of long-term single people. And while you don't actually need to be in a relationship to be happy, men typically are happier and healthier when partnered. Here are 3 broad trends in the relationship landscape that suggest heterosexual men are in for a rough road. First one is dating apps, right? Whether you're just starting to date or you're recently divorced and dating again, dating apps are a huge driver of new romantic connections in the United States. The only problem is that upwards of 62% of users are men, and many women are overwhelmed with how many options they have. Competition in online dating is fierce, and lucky in-person chance encounters with dreamy partners are rarer than ever. Now, first thing I'd say in response to any of this is one of the complaints I've heard from women over the years in regard to dating apps is how many men they've met that were already in relationships. So that's one of the things that's not really being dealt with here. 62% of users are men. How many of those men are already in relationships? Right? How many of those men are seeking other partners? Right? That's one of the things I would put on the table. This idea that they're sitting at home alone versus, women who have more options. It's one dimensional. You can feel lonely and have multiple people, right? But at the end of the day, that is what it is. So if we go back up to bullet point number 1, no, not that one. Where'd it go? Oh, there we go. This first sentence there. Younger and middle-aged men are the loneliest they've ever been. Right. Hold on. Right. and they're doing this study based on age, gender, and cultural differences in loneliness. If you're going to start talking about cultural differences in loneliness, you're opening up a sliding scale. Because again, to be lonely doesn't necessarily mean you're single. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't have any options. You may have 5 people you're with. Feeling lonely and having company or being in relationships, 3 separate things, right? So anyway, second bullet point, relationship standards. With so many options, it's not surprising that women are increasingly selective. I do a live TikTok show and speak with hundreds of audience members every week. I hear recurring dating themes from women ages 25 to 45. They prefer men who are emotionally available, good communicators, and share similar values. Okay. Skills deficits. Here we go with this bullshit. For men, this means a relationship skill gap that, if not addressed, will likely lead to fewer dating opportunities, less patience for poor communication skills, and longer periods of being single. The problem for men is that emotional connection is the lifeblood of healthy long-term love. Emotional connection requires all the skills that families are still not consistently teaching their young boys. So it sounds like he's blaming families, but really he's low-key blaming men, from boyhood on, and suggesting that they just don't have the skills, which in turn should let you know that his standard for how he's defining emotional and communication skills, emotional connection skills, so on and so forth, is defined by a measure of what women consider it is. We might be dealing with a time period where men are demanding that their own values be taken into account when we start to measure what good communication goals are, what good relationship goals are, and that means an upsetting of the balance. Because traditionally, we've defined these things strictly in terms of women's feelings about it. What women report, what women require. And that's been the case since the 1980s, at least. Most particularly when you had this serious rise, it's from the 70s to the 80s, most particularly, you had this rise in psychology and relationship, kind of popular works, right? You had talk show culture, you had relationship books, so on and so forth. Much of this has been tilted in terms of women's expectations because it came about during the rise of feminism. One of the things I argue we're dealing with on a couple of levels, you'll hear me break down today, is the rise of men making their presence felt and demanding to be heard and understood. See, like, this is one of the reasons I started developing the concept a few months ago of men's relationship emotional labor. Because when you talk about emotional labor, it's always strictly been defined in terms of women. Women complaining about how much work they do and how little men do. When I've been arguing, it's not that men do less work, it's that men do different work. And because we're only using a female lens, we ignore the work men do. I think the same thing is happening here in terms of how he's defining relationship skills, communication skills, emotional connection. All of these terms, he's still defining by women's standards. So the scale is unbalanced, and it makes men look like they're productive and they're not contributing. I think what men are doing they're starting to push back, even in they're stepping back from relationships. They're pushing back from standards that haven't worked and have not included them. And so this kind of outdated approach in terms of this gentleman's approach, it doesn't take that into account at all. He's still using women as the defining marker. So it continues. While there's probably no chance of stemming the rising tide of unintentional single men, there's still good news. The algorithms are becoming increasingly more complex on dating apps and other online platforms. One benefit is that great matches are on the rise. Hinge, one dating app, found through beta trials that 90% of users rated their first date positively, with 72% indicating wanting a second date. How can men reap the benefit of the algorithms? Level up your mental health game, right? Low-key suggestion, we have problems. We have the problems that are causing problems in relationships. They're causing problems with people even meeting and getting together successfully because it's men that aren't able to communicate and have no relationship skills when compared to women, according to, his kind of approach. So the suggestion that men level up their mental health game low-key suggests that women's mental health game is fine. Men are the problem. Now there's already, we've been talking about this for decades. There's already plenty of data to suggest that the amount of therapy and medication that goes hand in hand with mental health issues have been on the rise for women consistently. But he doesn't seem to bring that up here. So he lays the problem at men's feet and leaves it there. That means getting into some individual therapy to address your skills gap. It means valuing your own your own internal world and respecting your ideas enough to communicate them effectively. It means seeing intimacy, romance, and emotional connection as worthy of your time and effort, which presupposes that men don't think those things are important, which I disagree with. But I do agree that men could learn to communicate better, but I talk about it from the context of black men. And that has more to do with the silencing that we've been socialized with in terms of being able to be seen as human, let alone anything else. But that's slightly different. It's connected, but slightly different. But to generalize this in terms of men across the board, again, I think he's using a female standard, a feminist influence standard that is inherently in and of itself misandric and just kind of, pushes men into a category of being this whole problem that needs to step up its game. So he continues, ultimately, we have an opportunity to revolutionize romantic relationships and establish new healthy norms, starting with a first date. I think men are already revolutionizing relationships, and they're doing so by voting with their feet. But we'll see. It's likely that some of these romances will be transformative and healing, disrupting generational trauma and establishing a fresh culture of admiration and validation. Men have a key role in this transformation, but only if they go all in. It's going to take that kind of commitment to themselves, to their own mental health, to the kind of love they want to generate in the world. Will we step up? Whatever. Look, my approach to a lot of this, as you all know, is as a black masculinist, I'm first looking at black men. That's the group I'm most concerned with. And I'm only covering this article, not because, this has been a macro issue, but the people who sent it to me were mostly black men who were also sending the chat amongst black women who were using this article to slander men. They were using this article to basically say that the article confirms all of the negative biased statements about black men over the years. And there's a couple things I wanted to point out that the article overlooks. Now, shout out to attorney Dennis Sperling. I saw this on a community tab that he posted on YouTube a little while ago. Pew Research Center study. I actually found the study itself by myself, but I had already read the result when I saw his post earlier. So I ended up kind of finding it. I wasn't looking for what he posted, and it confirmed the same thing he had already posted. So shout out to attorney Sperling. But it says rising share of U.S. adults are living without a spouse or partner, right? And then, of course, the beginning, sentence that's highlighted, a new Pew Research Center analysis of census data finds that in 2019, roughly 4 in 10 adults ages 25 to 54, 38% were unpartnered, that is, neither married nor living with a partner. This share is up sharply from 29% in 1990. Men are now more likely than women to be unpartnered, which wasn't the case 30 years ago. Now, I would also question the terms they're using. If the standard for how this is measuring company, relationships, engagement with the opposite sex, and intimate context, this is a little vague, right? Because if marriage or living with a partner is the standard, well, in the black community, I think the lowest community in terms of marriage, as far as marriage rates are concerned, not being married and not actually living with a woman has nothing to do with whether or not we're in a relationship. We've engaged relationships differently over the decades. And so this measure doesn't capture those shifts. So again, if you're going to try and talk about men being unpartnered, that does not mean that you're talking about men sitting at home alone who are incapable of interacting with women, getting in relationships, having intimacy on any level you want to talk about it, whether it's a one-night stand or whether it's an ongoing, long-term, in-depth relationship. All of those things can happen without being married and without living with someone, right? I think that's one of the things this study is already missing from the jump. But let's scroll down to the more relevant area, right? See the highlighted paragraph, and this is key. There are differences by race and ethnicity in the share of prime working age adults who are partnered and unpartnered. Among those ages 25 to 54, 59% of black adults were unpartnered in 2019. This is higher than the shares among Hispanic at 38%, white 33%, and Asian 29% adults. For most racial and ethnic groups, men are more likely than women to be unpartnered. The exception is among black adults, where women, 62%, are more likely to be unpartnered than men. So it's interesting. I don't think the study adequately uses the right terms and concepts to study the black community, but even by its standards, everything he just said in the article he wrote on Psychology Today doesn't apply to black America the same way. So that being said, whether black women are more unpartnered than black men, or whether the study doesn't adequately capture black life, black relationship life, or relational life. Either way, his article doesn't tell us anything about Black America. So before this turns into a slam fest in regard to Black men, I would say none of these are appropriate. Right? None of these, the study or the Psychology Today article, adequately capture Black relationships. But I will lay out a little bit of context for something, right? First things first. So this is a chart that you can find on blackdemographics.com. And I like using these charts. I'm actually a regular monthly donor because I support it. I support, any mechanism that provides empirical data and makes it accessible to the people, especially when it's tailored to Black interests. So I urge you to also consider supporting blackdemographics.com. But this particular chart deals with the war on drugs effect on Black marriage, right? And you can look at it, and you can, screenshot it yourself or go to the site directly and look for it and so on and so forth. I didn't provide the link for this chart in the description box, but again, blackdemographics.com. If you go into the gender area and click on men or women, you're likely to find it. What you should notice here is that the yellow column points to where marriages start to severely decline, or I should say the increase of never married Black men becomes apparent. And that begins in 1980 as it relates to the war on drugs. And you'll notice the incarceration numbers are significantly high as well. So the war on drugs, the use of drugs, being arrested for drugs, use or sale, all of those things impact Black marriage right around 1980, right? So that's the first thing to notice. We're gonna notice a couple other things, right? So this chart looks at Black women. Same site. Now Black Demographics is using the Census Bureau data, right, as far as where they're getting the information from. But this chart, right, kind of shows us a comparison between Black and white women. And it suggests that 10 years prior to when the war on drugs has an evident impact on the Black community, in 1970, you start to see a massive shift in the unmarried state of Black women. 1970. Now, some of the think pieces that we have out now would suggest to you, well, this is women. This is when Black women are making this decision because they want to be independent. Okay. Now, the Black women's independence, kind of movement really kicks in the late 70s and most particularly by the mid 80s. But it's as early as 1970 where you see the marriage rates start to decline in terms of its impact on Black women. Now, what I would suggest to you is that there is an earlier issue that predates both the war on drugs and Black women's marriage prospects, and that's Black men. Again, from blackdemographics.com, again, using Census Bureau data. But if you look at this chart closely, it compares Black men and white men in terms of marriage. And what we see is that it is 20 years earlier than the war on drugs' most evident impact, and 10 years earlier than Black women's numbers, where you start to see Black men pulling away from marriage. And that's 1960, right? That's 1960. So this is important. What we're seeing is that prior to some of the major issues that impact the Black community in the 1980s and Black women's marital prospects in the 70s, it's Black men who are pulling away from marriage first. And there are a number of things. There are a number of reasons why. I can go into depth on a number of them, but I'm just going to pull two for today that have a significant impact. Now, first, you're dealing with successive wars. Right? We went from World War II in the 40s, then we did Korea, then Vietnam. These things affected Black men. Black women weren't going to war. Not in any significant numbers. And don't hit me with the all Black men, all Black women bullshit. The reality is a very select and a fraction of Black women participated in the wars. A larger portion of Black men did, but it had an impact on the Black community and most particularly on Black men. Right? The second option that I want to point your attention to, if you will, comes from a conservative site, but for me, I don't measure, I don't reference something if it's right 24 hours a day. I reference something if it's right in regard to the question I'm asking. And in this regard, we're looking at what impact, what things took place and when that could have impacted black men's decision making, right? So I'm saying that the wars are a factor. I'm saying that unemployment is a factor, because keep in mind, it's during World War II that we actually begin to migrate up out of the South. And we're doing so mainly for jobs, right? Moving out of sharecropping and moving out for jobs. East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, black folks are migrating often by train, often by foot, you know what I mean, to get wherever they can get outside of the South. Well, one of the biggest problems that came with that is it started with employment during World War II, but when those white male soldiers came back from war, white women that took their places in factories for a short period of time went back to the home, as far as middle-class white women go. And even some of the black women that were working in these factories, you know, lost their jobs, but black men took a big hit. They took a big hit in the 1940s. But we weren't about to go back down south. So the Great Migration, as it's referred to, meant that we migrated out of the South, but we weren't going to head back just because those jobs were taken away. This is the advent of the ghetto. Whether you're talking about the East Coast, the Midwest, or the West Coast, the ghetto for black Americans comes about after World War II, when those jobs are taken back and black folk refuse to go back down south because the only thing waiting for us there was sharecropping. So we stayed wherever we had moved to, but we were pushed off into the outskirts of the city and left in areas with very little employment, very little support, so on and so forth. Now that led, in many ways, to President Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty, which really kicks in the mid-60s, early to mid-60s, right? So one of the things we're talking about also in regard to the war on poverty is welfare. And this conservative site lays it out pretty well. The disastrous effects of the government's management of anti-poverty initiatives are recognizable across racial lines, but the destruction is particularly evident in the black community. It effectively subsidized the dissolution of the black family by rendering the black man's role as a husband and a father irrelevant, invisible, and more specifically, disposable. The result has been several generations of blacks born into broken homes and broken communities experiencing social, moral, and economic chaos. It fosters an inescapable dependency that primarily and oftentimes solely relies on the government to sustain livelihoods. But I argue that it went a step further. So that's Project 21, Black Leadership Network. Like I said, a conservative site that I agree with their conclusion on that particular issue. Here's the thing. It didn't just foster dependency. This is the part nobody really wants to talk about because it means critiquing many black women. It means critiquing black female culture. It means critiquing black feminism. And most people don't want that smoke. I, on the other hand, don't give a fuck. So let me tell you how this impacts black America in a way that others don't want to talk about. It boosts black women's sense of entitlement. And by black women's, I'm not talking about every individual person. I'm talking about black women's culture, right? Most particularly from the boomers to Generation X. I am Generation X. I grew up watching it. Now, boomers would still get married and often still be in long relationships, but they began to stress to their daughters the importance of being financially independent, getting your education, having your own career, not having to rely on a man. That men, that I don't need a man mentality, it was popularized by Generation X, but the foundation of it was laid by black women boomers. And these were often married women who were with husbands who worked. This is what they taught their daughters. Now, what they taught their sons was how to cook and clean for themselves in many instances. How to wash clothes, how to cook your own meals, how to do chores, so on and so forth. This was an attempt at an equalizing measure, right? This was an early programming to suggest that there were no gender divides, no gender rules. And they wanted to disrupt that because of how unhappy they were with those standards. Boomers still grew up with a sense of gender roles. Generation X was really the first generation to really have these ideas imposed on them that there really were no gender roles in the black community, most particularly. So boys needed to know how to wash, cook, clean. Girls needed to focus on their careers. It was almost a reversal of the traditional idea. And so by the time Generation X hit adulthood, what you really began to see was this push for independence that was nigh a religious movement. You heard the same kind of concepts and words, almost word for word, coming out of every woman's mouth you dated. I want to be independent. I want my freedom. I mean, these women are in their 50s and 60s now, and they're still using that language. Still. You're meeting women who have never been married in their 50s, who are contemplating marriage because they're feeling lonely and they're dealing with financial issues, especially in the midst of this post-pandemic moment. And they're talking about independence and freedom still. It's happening now, right? So that said, it's still going, and these ideas have been passed on to the latter generations. Millennials, Generation Z, they're being passed down, most particularly filtered through Generation X women. So it's become a norm for women to push for career, which is why when Kevin Samuels comes along and says, you do know the math doesn't work. And I was just talking to a 30-year-old last night about this very issue, right? Lovely young lady, former student of mine, brilliant, but she fell into this feminist programming too. So now she's 30 with no prospects and wondering if she'll be able to have a child, let alone be married. But she's got a master's degree. She's in her career, but she hates her career. And now the clock is ticking, as they say. See, because they were taught these ideas from boomers, and the ideas were, don't let these men control you. But it wasn't about men controlling women. It was about adapting to what nature does to our bodies. And the fundamental thing you can't get away from is that biologically men can continue to impregnate into their upper years. Women, and in order to have a healthy birth, have to do so within a certain time frame. I've covered this in a few shows ago where I talked about this. When you look at Black women over 40 having babies, the percentage of them that die giving birth is over 260%. No other community of women in their 40s and onward, not Latinas, not Native Americans, not white women, come close to those numbers. Actually, I shouldn't say Native Americans, because the study I looked at, I don't think it included them. Actually, it may have. I'm not sure if it included Native Americans, but I can say in terms of white and Latina women, they didn't come close. They were like in 70, 80% range, but Black women were 260%. The reason that percentage was so high is because no other community pushed female independence to the degree Black folk did. And what that meant, when you say focus on education, focus on careers, it means that people don't really start taking relationships seriously until their 30s, even after they have a couple children. We can get into a whole discussion about the impact of not having a consistent man in the house, i.e. father, husband, and how it impacts kids. As much as we want to rail against the traditional family model, the idea still plays out. Families without fathers do worse. It just is what it is. But that was the popular idea. Get married later, after your career. Well, so Black people have no inherited wealth. It takes us longer to establish. It takes Black men longer to get the wealth in place to be able to sustain a family. But at the end of the day, you're also dealing with a Black female philosophy of independence from men, and a real kind of problematic relationship with men, not even knowing what men want, not even being socialized to care what men value. What many of these women from Generation X and onward were taught is as long as you had a wet hole, that was all men needed. Now, it's not surprising that the caliber of men that would contribute their sperm to that dynamic tended to be fairly low. And the men that they said they wanted, middle class and above, didn't randomly reproduce with whomever had a wet hole. It is what it is. Half of Black men have no kids. That's not an accident. It is what it is. So that being said, you have this marital gap. You have this, press for independence. And although it pushes up against being able to find the very thing you want in terms of family, in terms of connectedness, all of these things are major factors in the state of Black America right now. And half of what we need to hear, we don't want to talk about because it's uncomfortable for women to hear from someone else. It has to be, put just a certain way to make it sound good and make people feel good. That's why we talk about independence as opposed to loneliness or dysfunctional families. See, that's the product of this kind of independence movement too. And this author who's writing this Psychology Today piece, Dr. Greg Matos, isn't talking about Black America. He's not dealing with entitlement. And you can have a conversation about entitlement in terms of Western women in general. And these things are impacting other communities. But the Black community, it's magnified that much more. It's on a whole nother level. So when you look at this stuff, you got a lot more to add to this discussion. The linchpin for marriages in the Black community was not men's lack of relationship skills, communication skills. It's not because women really pushed for independence. That came a little later. It was because men withdrew first. From war to unemployment to the war on poverty and the use of welfare that eliminated the need for men, and the rise of an independence culture that came about later, men took further and further step backs. I've been saying this for years now. It was a silent protest. And it really wasn't directed at women per se, it was directed at the situation. But the more women began to internalize these ideas and champion them, took on a different bent. Because now you had grandmothers teaching mothers, teaching daughters, teaching granddaughters that they didn't need men. And none of them grew up with men in the home. So there wasn't a respect for men. There wasn't even a sense of how to communicate with men. And there damn sure wasn't a sense of what men's values were. Men were stereotypes, archetypes for the most negative qualities in human beingness. But again, all of that distilled down into men only need a wet hole. And when I do talk to men, I remember talking to women in my own generation since we were kids. One of the things I heard, consistently from them, even early on, was that even when they do get married, they plan to control their husbands using sex. Because again, you can do that if all you believe men are these beings that just need to put their penises somewhere. So now we need to really complicate this piece, this article, and apply it to Black America and challenge it with actual data and history. I look forward to your thoughts. Peace.